The cold air carried the sound through the crowded city streets. A melody so haunting, so raw, that it seemed to carve through the noise of honking cars and hurried footsteps. It wasn't just another street performer playing for spare change. No, there was something different about this one. His voice carried an ache, a depth that pulled at the soul. And for those who really listened, it felt like a story was being told through every note. James Parker didn't have time for stories. His life was a carefully scheduled routine, filled with meetings, deadlines, and an ever-growing list of tasks that kept his mind too busy for distractions. He was a businessman, the kind who walked with purpose, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, mind already racing ahead to his next move. But today was different. As he strode past the familiar street corner, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement, the music hit him like a wall. It wasn't just sound. It was something else, something that made him stop mid-step, as if an invisible force had reached out and grabbed him. His fingers tightened around his phone, his mind fighting against the pull of the melody. But it was too late. The song had found him. A few feet away, sitting on a worn-out stool, was the musician. His guitar was old, its wood darkened by time and countless strums. His clothes were layered, mismatched, and frayed at the edges. And yet, there was a quiet dignity in the way he played, his fingers dancing across the strings like they had a mind of their own. His voice, though slightly rough, was rich with emotion, like a man who had lived through the lyrics he was singing. James couldn't move. It was irrational, frustrating even, but something in the song kept him rooted to the spot. He had places to be, emails to send, a lunch meeting in 20 minutes. But right now, none of that seemed to matter. His mind, always so full of numbers and strategies, suddenly felt still. The lyrics spoke of loss, of roads taken and roads missed, of choices made in the rush of ambition, only to look back and wonder, was it worth it? James felt a strange tightening in his chest. His breath caught in his throat, as if the words had been written just for him. His phone buzzed in his hand, snapping him back to reality. He glanced down, saw the name flashing on the screen, his assistant, reminding him of his next meeting. But for the first time in years, he ignored the call. Instead, he stepped closer. The street musician barely acknowledged him, his focus entirely on his performance. A small battered case lay open at his feet, a handful of coins and crumpled bills inside. James hesitated, his fingers grazing his wallet. Normally, he'd toss, in some cash, a quick nod, and be on his way. But this time, something told him that wasn't enough. The song was coming to an end, the final notes lingering in the air like a whispered secret. The musician exhaled softly, his fingers still resting on the strings. And then finally, he looked up. Their eyes met, and in that moment, James felt something shift, something he couldn't quite explain. He opened his mouth to speak, and then a sharp voice cut through the air. "Sir, there you are! You're late for your meeting." James turned to see his assistant, rushing toward him. Concern etched across her face. The city noise rushed back in, as if the moment had never happened. He glanced back at the musician, but the spell had been broken, or had it? Because deep down, James knew this wasn't over. Not yet. James barely heard his assistant's words. His mind was still tangled in the last few notes of the song. The way the melody had settled in his chest, like an unanswered question, he gave a short nod, forcing himself to move. But even as he stepped away, he stole one last glance at the musician. The man had already lowered his gaze, fingers absent-mindedly plucking at the guitar strings. It was as if nothing had happened. as if James had never stood there, caught in something far bigger than he could understand. By the time he arrived at his meeting, James was late. He never ran late. He prided himself on being efficient, always, one step ahead. But today, his thoughts were elsewhere. Words blurred together. Business deals and contracts suddenly felt hollow. And no matter how much he tried to focus, he could still hear the song playing in the back of his mind. "James, are you with us?" The voice snapped him out of his daze. A group of executives sat across from him, waiting for his response. His assistant gave him a nervous glance, as if silently urging him to get it together. "Of course," he said quickly, straightening his posture. He forced himself to talk numbers, projections, all the things that had once come so easily to him. And yet, beneath it all, he felt different. The day dragged on, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The song wasn't just a tune. It was a question, a reminder, a whisper from a past he had long buried. That night, instead of heading straight home to his high-rise apartment, he found himself walking back toward the street corner. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe the musician would still be there, playing another song that would somehow unravel more of whatever had stirred inside him. Maybe he could just listen. Let the melody explain what he couldn't put into words. But when he arrived, the corner was empty. The stool was gone. The case of coins vanished. It was as if the musician had never existed. James stood there for a long moment, staring at the quiet street. He let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. It was ridiculous. He was acting. Ridiculous. He was a businessman, a logical thinker, someone who didn't get caught up in things like this. And yet, here he was. The days passed, but the restlessness didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. James became obsessed with the thought of finding the musician again, of understanding why that song had shaken him so deeply. He started asking around. Shopkeepers, street vendors, even other performers. Most shook their heads. A few vaguely recalled seeing a guitarist now and then, but no one knew his name or where he stayed. It was a strange feeling, chasing a ghost. Then, one evening, as he was about to give up, he saw him. Tucked into the shadows of a quieter street, the musician sat on the ground, strumming his guitar. The melody was softer this time, more intimate, as if played only for himself. James hesitated before stepping forward. "Hey," he said. The musician glanced up, his expression unreadable. Up close, James noticed things he hadn't before. The tired lines around his eyes, the way his hands, though strong, bore the roughness of years spent in the cold. "You played the other day," James continued, feeling oddly self-conscious. "That song, it stopped me in my tracks." The musician gave a small, almost knowing smile. Music does that sometimes. James nodded, unsure of what to say next. He wasn't used to conversations like this, ones without a clear purpose, without an agenda. But he needed to know. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The musician's fingers brushed the guitar strings absent-mindedly. "Been playing all my life. Used to do it for a living once." James caught something in his tone. A weight, a story left unsaid. "What happened?" The musician exhaled, as if deciding whether to answer. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Life," he said simply. And somehow, James understood exactly what he meant. For a long moment, they just stood there, the sound of the guitar filling the silence between them. James felt something stir deep inside him, a question he had been too afraid to ask himself. Was he really living the life he wanted? Or was he just moving forward because he didn't know how to stop? He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. James wasn't sure why he kept coming back. Every evening after work, he found himself drawn to that quiet street, to the sound of the musician's guitar. He no longer checked his watch, no longer worried about unread emails piling up. Instead, he just listened. And little by little, the musician began to talk. His name was Daniel. Years ago, he had been a rising star in the music world, a songwriter with promise, a voice that had once filled small venues with hopeful crowds. But life had a way of pulling people off course. A bad deal, a broken trust, and a series of choices that had seemed right at the time, but led him further and further away from the dream. Before he knew it, years had passed, and the only stage left was the street corner. James found himself relating to Daniel in ways he hadn't expected. He had always thought success meant pushing forward, never stopping, never questioning. But now, standing here with this man who had once chased a dream with the same fire James had for business, he started to wonder, had he lost himself somewhere along the way? One night, James showed up with something different. He wasn't just there to listen. He was there with an idea. "You should record," he said. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "And who's going to listen to a washed-up street musician?" "I will," James said. "And so will a lot of other people." James didn't know the first thing about the music industry, but he did know how to build something from nothing. He had spent years creating businesses, making deals, taking risks, and for the first time in a long time, he wanted to use that skill for something that wasn't about profit. At first, Daniel resisted. He had spent too long believing his chance had passed. But James was persistent. He found a small recording studio, made a few calls, and somehow convinced Daniel to give it a shot. The first time Daniel stepped in front of a microphone, something changed. The moment he started singing, it was as if all the years, all the setbacks, melted away. The song wasn't just music. It was a story, raw and real, the kind of thing that people couldn't ignore. James watched from the other side of the glass, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement, purpose, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the biggest changes. The recording made its way online. At first, it was just a few shares, a handful of people stopping to listen. But then something happened. The song started spreading. People connected with it, with the story behind it. The same way it had stopped James in his tracks that first day, it now reached thousands of others. One night, as they sat outside the studio, Daniel turned to James and said, "You saved me." James shook his head. "No," he said. "You saved me." Because the truth was, Daniel's music had done something no business deal ever could. It had reminded James what it meant to feel something real. Months later, James sat in the audience of a small but packed venue. The lights dimmed, and Daniel stepped onto the stage, guitar in hand. The crowd went silent as he strummed the first note. James smiled to himself. Somewhere along the way, in the most unexpected place, he had found exactly what he didn't even know he was looking for. And for the first time in years, he was truly living.